Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Tes Vav has two mishnayos in it, and therefore three main topics to be discussed. The first half of the daf is a lengthy machlokes between Abaye and Rava about a lechi which was not installed for the purpose of functioning as a lechi. Can it count as a lechi or not? Then we get to our first mishnah on the daf, which discusses a lechi made out of animals. Does that count? And also two other halachos about whether or not you're allowed to use living creatures for certain concepts. And then the second mishnah goes to the subject of a group which camped in a field before Shabbos, and they tried to build a wall, how that wall is constructed, and we'll get to several halachas about gaps and doorways based on that mishnah. So first of all, the daf begins with a very well-known machlokes between Abaye and Rava about lechi ha'omid me'elav. That is the lamed in the acronym Ya'al Kigam, which people have seen in the beginning of Perek Elu Metzias. It's one of the six machlokes and throughout all of Shas where the halacha comes out conclusively like Abaye. The discussion is what happens if you have a lechi which was not built for the purpose of being a lechi. It's a pole on the side of a mavai which could serve as a side post, but that's not why it was installed. Does that count or not? So the Gemara says there's two ways of looking at this. There's two possible cases here. One case could be where you used to have a different lechi, and that lechi fell down. And therefore this lechi, the one that you want to use now, was never intended to be a lechi because you always had a different one. You never relied on this lechi before. Can you use it now, even though it's in the middle of Shabbos? The Gemara says, in that case, there's no machlokes. Abaye and Rava agree that you never had intent to use it. You always had a different lechi. You never used it before, and therefore you cannot rely on this lechi. It's no good. The question is where you didn't have a different lechi that fell down. This lechi was created without intent. It was meant to do something else, but you never had a different lechi. You want to know, I never built it to be used as a lechi. Can I turn it into a lechi now? Or does it have to be installed initially as a lechi? That's the question, and the Gemara brings no less than 7 proofs. So the first couple of proofs aren't really to lechis, they're to walls. Walls where you need a halachic wall, such as a wall of a sukkah or a wall of an eruv or something like that. The Gemara is working off the assumption here that this machlokes applies just the same by lechis and by walls. They're both halachic structures. The same machlokes should apply. If I can use a lechi that was not installed for the purpose of being a halachic lechi, I should be able to use a wall that was not installed for the purpose of being a halachic wall. So the Gemara's first proof is about a sukkah. We have a brayso that says if you have a sukkah that is made out of trees, growing trees, the trees are serving as the wall, of course, as long as they're not branching over the sukkah, because that would be schach psula. But as far as the wall is concerned, the trees can serve as the wall. Now, those weren't planted as a wall. So Gemara says, no, the cases where you actually planted them in order to be a wall of the sukkah, that was the intent. It's not a case where it wasn't installed for that reason. So the Gemara says, well, then what would be the chiddush? You installed it for that reason. What's the problem? The Gemara says the chiddush is that you may think that you shouldn't be allowed to use a sukkah with tree walls because you may end up using the tree. You may end up climbing the tree, hanging things on the tree. That's forbidden to do on Yantiv. But you're allowed to. That's a chiddush over here. Okay, second proof. It's discussing the case of the well. As we've seen a few times in the Masechta, Chazal made a special leniency for travelers going to Yerushalayim that needed to draw water on Shabbos. They couldn't draw from inside the well because the well is Rishus HaYachid and the area outside it is Rishus HaRabim. They couldn't bring the water from the Rishus HaYachid in the well out to the Rishus HaRabim. So they allowed you to put rudimentary walls around the well so that the space within the wall should be considered Rishus HaYachid. Those walls consisted of 4 corner pieces. That's all they were. So Bryce describing it says that if you had a wall made out of growing reeds, that was okay. It could count as one of those corner pieces. So the Gemara says the assumption is the reeds weren't planted for that reason, and the Gemara answers no. This is talking about the reeds were planted for that reason. Again, the question is, why would I think that you would not be allowed to use it if it was planted for that reason? This is because there's a discussion about whether or not these corners are allowed to be made out of reeds that are less than 3 tvachim wide. Here, the chiddush is that even though it's less than 3 tvachim wide, you're allowed to count the reeds as wall pieces. Okay, third proof. If you have a tree, and the tree has a very large area of branches, and it's all leaning over, the entire branches forms kind of a roof. So a roof counts as an eruv. You're allowed to carry under a roof. even though there isn't walls, the roof itself carries a roofed area counts as an Eruvin area. So we have a brisa that says that you're allowed to carry under this roofed area if it reaches to within 3 tefachim of the ground. And again, this is a tree, so the assumption would be that it wasn't planted for that reason. And the Gemara says, no, it was planted for that reason. That was why it was created. So the Gemara says, if that's true, then we have a different problem over here, because this tree only works as an Eruv if the area that it's encompassing is less than a base sasayim. Base sasayim is about 5,000 square amas. So we have a general rule that certain types of walls don't work for large areas. Certain weak walls don't work for large areas. We'll see that it applies to this halacha of the roof. It applies to a wall which is weak. It's only made of straight sticks. There's no crisscross. And also applies to a wall which wasn't made for the purpose of living within. It's just an enclosed area. So the Gemara is asking over here, if this was planted for this reason, so what's wrong with this tree? Why can't it work even if it's more than a base society, even if it's more than 5,000 amas? Why do we consider it a weak wall? The Gemara says the weakness here is not the fact that it was growing on its own. The weakness is that the purpose of this enclosure is not meant to live in it. It's meant to live outside it, and it's just a place you escape to. Right? The function of this shaded area is for people who are working in the fields or they're working in the forest and they need a place to rest and they need some shelter. So their main purpose of being here is not to work here. They don't want to use the part inside it. It's a place for them to retreat from their main purpose for being here, which is to work in the fields. A case like that is not a super enclosure. It's not really an enclosure you're trying to use to live in, and therefore it's weak and it's limited to less than 5,000 square amas. Okay, next proof. This proof talks about the halacha of Erev Techumin, or Tchumin in general. The halacha is that you are not allowed to travel more than 2,000 amas from your place of residence on Shabbos. Now, your place of residence could be as large as the city you're in. If you're outside the city, it could be as large as the building, the house, or the Rosh Hashanah that you're in. So what if somebody began Shabbos out in a field, but he was on a hilltop, which was 10 amas, which was 10 tefachim tall, or he was in a ditch which is 10 tefachim deep? So that's Rosh Hashanah. So he's allowed to walk around that entire hilltop or ditch. That's all counted as his Rosh Hashanah, and he's also allowed to go 2,000 amas past the edges of that Rosh Hashanah. If he doesn't have any Rosh Hashanah, he only gets 4 amas, and then the 2,000 amas begin outside those 4 amas. So if this hilltop or the ditch are larger than 4 amas, he gains. He can go further than 2,000 amas past his 4 amas. He can go 2,000 amas past the edges of this Rosh Hashanah. And then this brisa adds a third halacha to this applies, and that's if he was in a field and they chopped down the stalks growing in the field, but they left a wall of stalks growing so that it serves as a wall for him, and that's Rosh Hashanah for him, so he would have the same halacha. It counts as a wall, and he can move past the wall. So the Gemara says, now I know what you're going to tell me. You're going to tell me that since the stalks were left up for the purpose of serving as a wall, that counts as if it was made for this reason. But what are you going to tell me about the hilltop and the ditch? Those are usually there from creation, and the ditch here is not referring to a ditch in the earth, it's referring to a nick in stone, where the stone is hollowed out. That's not something that was created by somebody. That's been here since time immemorial. So how can you tell me it was made for the purpose? Obviously it was not, and therefore this should be a proof that you're allowed to use a wall, and therefore also a lechi, even if it was not made for the halachic purpose that you would like to use it for. So Gemara says, I will accept this as far as walls, and I'm going to tell you that they never argued about walls. They all agree you're allowed to use a wall. A wall counts, even if it wasn't made for the purpose of serving as a halachic wall. The only machlokes they have is about a lechi. And the reason for the machlokes is different than we said before. The reason is because they're arguing as to what is the logic behind a lechi. Does it serve as a wall? Does it serve as a sign? If it serves as a wall, so then just like all walls, you can use one which was not made there for the halachic purpose that you're using it for. And that's what Abaye holds. Rava says no, it was made as a sign. It was made as a reminder. And if it was there forever and it wasn't made for that purpose, it doesn't remind anybody of what it was there for. Okay, now the Gemara tries a few more proofs. And where it says if you have a mavoi, and one of the walls protrudes, the corner of one of the walls you have bricks that stick out. So if the bricks are within 3 tefachim of each other, it's lavud, and it counts as a lechi. Now here, it was these bricks began to stick out as part of the construction of the wall. Either that, or a piece of wall fell down, and the bricks are left sticking out. But it wasn't made to be a lechi. So Gemara says, no, the case was where it was actually built this way. The builder who built the wall left bricks protruding. So Gemara says, so what's a chiddush? Gemara says, the chiddush is that you may have thought that the bricks protruding are meant because he is planning on adding an extension at some point. He wants to extend this wall, and therefore he wants bricks protruding so that the wall will hold. He doesn't want a smooth wall. You can't attach another existing wall to a smooth piece of wall. The chiddush is that no, that's not what it was for. It was there to serve as a lechi, and we're not afraid that it looks like that's what it was for, and therefore it counts. Okay, next proof is from a brayso which we had earlier on Daf Tes. Brayso is brought by Rav Chia that says if you have a wall which is uneven, one part is wider than another part, as long as the wider part is visible from some point, either from inside the mavoi or from outside the mavoi, you see the part that sticks out because it's wider, that counts as a lechi. Here also wasn't built that way. So the Gemara says, of course, no, the answer is that it was built that way. It was built that way on purpose to serve as a lechi. The Gemara says, what would the chiddush be? The chiddush is that even though you can only see it from outside the mavoi, it still counts as a lechi, which is a discussion we had earlier. A lechi which you can only see from outside the mavoi and not from inside the mavoi, does that count as a mavoi or not? Okay, now the Gemara switches gears. Instead of bringing proofs from braysos, it brings a proof from an incident. Gemara says that Rav was sitting in a mavoi, and Rav Huna was sitting in front of him, and Rav asked his servant to go bring a bottle of water. So he went, and while he was gone, the lechi fell down in the mavoi, and now it was forbidden to carry within that mavoi. So Rav, as soon as his servant approached, he motioned for him to stop because he wasn't allowed to carry the bottle that he was holding. So Rav Huna said, but there's a tree here. Why can't you rely on the tree? And Rav said, what do you mean? Don't you learn anything in your life? You can't rely on a tree if you had a different lechi before. So Gemara says, hold on a second. In the case where there was a lechi before that fell down, we said that there's no machlokes. And that's the only reason that Rav's saying you can't rely on the lechi. Obviously, had there never been a lechi before, you would be allowed to rely on the tree, even though it wasn't planted for that reason. So you see like Abaye, you see that a lechi which was not made for the purpose of being a lechi, such as this tree, as long as there wasn't a different lechi which fell, you're allowed to rely on it, and that was what we said was the case of the machlokes. So the Gemara says, hold on a second, maybe we'll change the machlokes Abaye and Rava. Maybe they were really arguing in the case where the lechi fell down. In the case where the lechi never fell down, everybody agrees you're allowed to rely. But if there was a different lechi that fell, that's where they were arguing, and therefore the halacha here, Rav is passing like Rava that it's no good. So Gemara says, no, that was not the case. That was not the case. The cases where they were arguing over a lechi that was always there, and there was never another lechi beforehand that fell down. And we know that because specifically there was a case that they disputed over for years, where there was a piece of wall that served as a lechi in a different mavoi than it itself was created for, and that's this classic case, and therefore the halacha is like Abaye, and this is one of the Ya'al Kigam, one of the 6 cases where the halacha is like Abaye. The Lamed in Ya'al Kigam stands for lechi ha'omed mei elav. But now we get in the next Mishnah, which discusses using living creatures. 3 subjects which we would like to know about living creatures, and the majority of the discussion of the Gemara will be about using them for a get, for a shtar of divorce. So the Mishnah says as follows: you're allowed to make a lechi out of a living creature according to the Tanna Kama. Rabbi Meir disagrees. Living creature which is used as the cover of a grave, that's either the cover of the coffin or the tombstone, Machokas Rishonim. So there's a special tumah that applies to the cover of a grave that remains tameh, even if it's removed, it still retains tumas oel. So usually tumah doesn't apply to a living creature, but according to the Tanna Kama here, if it's used as the actual cover of a grave, it does get tumah. But Rabbi Meir says it does not. And the third halacha is you're allowed to write a get on the back of a living creature or not. That's a machlokes Rabbi Yossi Haglili, and the Chachamim, Rabbi Yossi Haglili says no, and the Chachamim say yes. The Gemara is primarily going to focus on this and where each opinion derives in halacha. But first, the Gemara brings a brayso which is similar to this Mishnah. The brayso says Rabbi Meir says anything which has life in it, any living creature, you cannot use it, not as a wall of a sukkah, and not as a lechi for a mavoi, and not as corner pieces for the well, and it doesn't get the special tumah of being a cover of a grave. And Rabbi Saglili says you're even not allowed to use it to write a get. Okay, now the Gemara goes through the opinions of Rabbi Saglili and the Chachamim. So first of all, Rabbi Saglili's sources as follows. The pasuk describing a get says, "V'chosav lo sefer krisos v'nasam b'yada." You should write for her a book of divorce and put it in her hand. So the Brisa says as follows. The fact that it says v'chosav lo, you should write for her, that indicates you could write anything. You didn't have to say write for her. That's extra. You could write it on anything. But the word sefer limits it. So it doesn't limit it to only a sefer, because he said you could write it on anything. So it limits it that you cannot use something which is either living or food. That doesn't count as a sefer. A sefer is neither living or food. Other than that, you can use anything. The Rabbanan say, look, if it would have said you should write it in a sefer, you should write a divorce in a sefer, so then I would agree. It has to be written in something which counts as a sefer. But over here it says, v'chasav lo sefer krisos. You just have to write it. All it is recording the events. It has no significance, and therefore there are no halachos to it. You're allowed to write it on anything that you want. So then the Gemara says, okay, that's very nice, but if they hold that you could hold it on anything, then they don't need the words v'chasav lo. There is no limitations, so why do I need the words v'chasav lo? I don't have a sefer as a limitation, and therefore I don't need v'chasav lo to include the fact that you're allowed to use anything. So the Gemara says the chiddush is that you're only allowed to divorce a woman with a written contract. You cannot use any of the other forms of device which we use for marriages. We know that there's a link in halacha between divorces and marriages. What works for a marriage works for a divorce. A contract works for a marriage as kiddushin. It also works for divorce. However, giving money works for marriage. That does not work for divorce. That's what we learn out of the words v'chasav lo. Now, of course, where does the Reis Haglili know that halacha from? That's because it says sefer krisos. You need a book of divorce. Something else serves as a there isn't anything else which serves as a book of divorce. Rashi explains that's from the fact that the word sefer is linked to krisos. The word sefer he uses to show that you can't use a living creature to record the get, but the fact that it's linked to krisos means that it has to be a book of divorce. Nothing else can divorce. Now, the Rabbanan, what do they do with that link there? So the Rabbanan say, that teaches me the halacha that he can't put conditions on the divorce that remain forever and restrict her. She has to be able to be free of him. If he says, you only divorce on the condition that you never drink wine the rest of your life, I mean, she's always tied to him by this condition, and therefore it's not a full separation between the two, and it doesn't count. How's Rabbi Yosef? Do we know that halacha? He learns from the fact that it says krisus instead of kares. The Rabbanan say that's not a drasha. There is nothing you can learn from that. Coming in the next Mishnah, which discusses what happens if a group of people camp in a field. How do they make the Eruv? And the halacha, the Mishnah says, is they pile up their kalim, their equipment, around them in a circle or a square, and that counts as a wall as long as you have three conditions. Number one, it has to be at least 10 tefachim high. Number two, you have to have more. You can't have more of the gaps than the filled-in area. It can't be more open than closed. More paritz merubah made. And number three, you can't have any single gap that is greater than 10 amos. So the Gemara's discussion is what happens if it's exact. What happens if you have exactly even amounts of gap and built-up area? The Gemara says it's a machlokes between Rav Papa, who says that it's mutter, and Rav Huna Beit Rav Yeshua says that it's aser. And the Gemara now brings a few proofs. First of all, our Mishnah seems to be a clear indication that it is mutter, because it says that as long as you don't have more gap than built, it's okay. That seems to imply that if it's exactly even, then it's okay also. It's only if you have more gap than built that it's a problem. So the Gemara wants to say, no, read it differently. Read it if it has more built than gap, then it's okay. So the Gemara says, but then what would be the halacha if it has less built than gap? If that's okay also, then it should say so. So the Gemara admits that this is a bit of a problematic language, and it does seem to indicate that it's okay, but the Gemara still continues to bring more proofs. The Gemara says concerning a sukkah. So if you build a sukkah, you want to put schach on. So now the schach is meant to be sticks of wood, but sticks of wood that are a kli, that have a function, are pasal schach, such as the leg of a bed or a spit for roasting. That is pasal schach. So if you have that stuff on the roof of your sukkah, it's no good. It's like the open spaces of the wall for an eruv. So the Brisa says if you have that stuff on the sukkah, but you have space between them that is equal to the thickness of those pasal schach itself, it's okay. You fill in those spaces with regular schach, and then it's okay. So this seems to indicate that even if it's even, it's still okay. You have an even amount of kosher and pasal schach, it's still okay. It should be the same thing with the walls, where you have an even amount of open and filled in space. So Gemara says, no, here, when it says that you have open space equal to the pasal schach, where you're going to stick kosher schach in the open space, it means that the open space is big enough to slide in and out something of the same size. Therefore, it has to be slightly bigger than the thing itself, otherwise it wouldn't slide in and out. So the Gemara thinks that when you say that, you mean that that's usually how you make it. When you slide, when you have an equal space, you mean it should be big enough to slide in and out. So the Gemara asks, but what would be the halacha if I put it in such a way that I can't slide it in and out? It's just equal. The Mishnah seems to indicate that that's okay also. It doesn't say that it has to be sliding in and out. So Gemara says, no, we're limiting the Mishnah. We're saying the Mishnah is referring to a situation where you have enough space to slide it in and out, and therefore you have slightly more open space than closed space. You have slightly more space to put kosher schach than you have space to put pasal schach. That's where it's okay. But if it would be exactly even, it would be pasal. The Gemara gives a second answer to the question here. The Gemara says that you're actually placing the kosher schach now perpendicular to the pasal schach, and therefore it doesn't matter even if it's exactly the same, you still end up with more kosher schach because it overlaps over the pasal schach.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.